Okay, before anyone says anything, yes, I know this isn't Soul Eater, but give me like 2 minutes and I will explain to you why. So over the course of the last month or so, I have gotten a ton of requests to build the characters from Frieren Beyond Journey's End, but the thing is, I already built them. Now this video aired over on the first channel, which is kind of not dead right now. And it actually did pretty good at the time for what that channel was getting. But rather than just link you guys to that video, I decided to re-record and re-edit it and put it up over here. So it's technically a little bit of an older video, it's still using the 2014 rules for anyone who likes that, but honestly not much would really change, just switching around a few levels of where they get certain abilities. That's about it. But again, this is just a re-recorded and re-edited video using the exact same builds. See, didn't even take 2 minutes, didn't even take 1 minute. But there is something else I want to talk about real quick before we get to the actual video. So you might have seen the post on Discord or on the community page, but we are participating in Extra Life again this year, and we are going to have some guests. Like RJ from D&D Build, the Ugly Goblin, my wife is the MC, and even Runesmith are all going to be hopping into the stream at different times and playing games with us. These games are going to range from like Baldur's Gate 3, Lethal Company, Helldivers, some Pokemon, and a few other things that I haven't figured out yet. We're also going to be giving away certain prizes as we reach certain donation goals throughout the stream. Some dice, a new player's handbook, a model that I haven't picked up yet, and on top of that, for every death that I personally suffer while streaming, that includes anything that I do, any Pokemon deaths, I'm going to be donating one of my own dollars to the charity. I know $1 isn't a lot, but I'm not exactly like rolling in money, but I can guarantee I'm going to die quite a bit. And this all is why I'm doing Frieren now instead of Soul Eater, because I need more time to prepare for the stream, and the Frieren video is going to be a lot easier to edit given that I'm going to be reusing some of my old footage. I hope to see you guys on the 2nd for the stream, and I'll let you guys get to the builds now. Frieren Beyond Journey's End is an amazing show, with an interesting concept, cool magic system, and most importantly, memorable characters. Even now, like a year later, I am still seeing Granny Frieren and Pouting Fern memes. And everything about this series just really made me want to build them in 5e, since that's the game I play. Now, despite Frieren being the title character and, you know, the main character of the show, we're actually not starting with her. Instead, I am going to start with the scruffy, red-headed warrior, Stark. Or Stark, but that's how my brain keeps wanting to say it. So Stark is cowardly, but he's at least a strong coward, having been trained directly under the warrior from the Heroes Party, a dwarf who's about as tough as they come. And despite having faced down the Demon King, Eisen was actually scared of Stark, so much so that his body reacted on its own and sucker punched him through the house. And Eisen isn't the only thing to react this way to Stark. When Stark showed up in a random town after the fight with his master, he scared off a dragon that was terrorizing the town. Even though he was paralyzed in fear, the dragon knew he was stronger than it and didn't want to mess with him. And yeah, Stark is kind of a beast. He cuts through cliff faces with an axe like it's nothing, and later on he did the exact same thing to that dragon from before. Now, despite this dragon's size, I am not going to say it is an ancient red dragon, since that would be way too much for Stark to 1v1, let alone to one-shot it effectively. Instead, I'm going to say this is a young red dragon which has a CR of 10, so Stark would still need to be pretty strong to 1v1 it, but it's a lot more reasonable than an ancient red dragon. Now, we have a few questions we need to answer, just kind of based off how we see Stark fighting. First off, is Stark even a human? He certainly looks like a human, but I have a much funner option that technically doesn't exist anymore. The half-orc. And I say this because Stark is a tank. His side sliced open, shoulder cleaved down through his collarbone and shoulder blade, and on top of that, he catches an axe blade with his abs. And looking at just how beaten down he was, I can only compare this to like Relentless Endurance from the half-orc, letting him stay at 1 HP instead of dying to this demon maid girl. Like, if you have to, just say he's a quarter orc or a 10th orc somewhere down the line and he just passes for human. Done. But Stark's class took me a little bit longer to work out. A lot of people, me included, usually associate axes with the barbarian class. But that's not a rule. Barbarians can use swords, clubs, or whatever. And in Stark's case, a fighter can use an axe. Just looking at how Stark fights, I think fighter fits him best. Sure, he uses a big axe and he hits really hard, but he's not flying into a bloodthirsty rage and can't think. He's actually somewhat strategic in his fights. So yeah, I'm going to say Stark is primarily a fighter, albeit a fighter that flavors his extra attacks as hitting one big attack, but a fighter nonetheless, and more importantly, a champion fighter. Simple and to the point, he hits you really goddamn hard. And being a fighter, Stark gets a fighting style. In this case, I think great weapon fighting works perfectly for him. And I'm guessing he's going to be somewhere around level 10. That might be a little bit high, but again, I present the dragon that he one-shot, so level 10 seems fine. This also means he gets a second fighting style, and I'm thinking superior technique so he can grab some maneuvers, and I'm going to go with menacing attack. Somewhere along the way, he's also going to grab the Great Weapon Master feat for even harder hits at the expense of accuracy, and bump up his strength by 2. But there's one kind of big issue with Stark. At most, he wears a coat for armor. And seeing how he has enough core strength to catch an axe blade, I think a quick 2-level dip into Barbarian for unarmored defense and reckless attack fits just fine. Especially since he was kind of planning to die with this attack, and that's pretty damn reckless. And honestly, until we get to Season 2, there isn't a lot left for Stark. We only have 2 fights in the first season, but for a fighter and a new adventurer at that, he's pretty impressive.
Big Fat Zero, okay? Don't abandon me, Frieren, I need you!
Now, something I really like about Frieren as a series and with the characters is they're not perfect. They have really noticeable flaws. Stark is a coward and does not understand people at all, but he's still a good guy, and when he messes up, he does his best to fix it. Sometimes Stark and Fern are kind of freaking out while Frieren is just relaxing, not bothered at all by the situation, because Frieren has had 1,000+ years to exist and know what's going on. Meanwhile, Stark and Fern are barely 18 and they are still very much growing up. And speaking of Fern, the apprentice to the great mage Frieren, she's next. Oh, and of course, if you are not subscribed already and you like these team builds, you should do that. I'm doing these team builds once every 2 weeks, and I'll be doing other stuff in between, maybe some streaming, other homebrew videos that I haven't quite done yet, and migrating stuff over from the first channel. Also, at some point between the original video and now, I lost the original character sheet for the Frieren team, so I had to remake those, so that was fun. Okay, that is enough goofing around, let's get back to the characters. Fern is kind of a stubborn girl, who can have trouble expressing her feelings outside of pouting. But she is a talented mage who's been training since she was a little girl, first with this old man and later with Frieren. Now for Fern, her race or species is really straightforward, she's a human, which is fine. As far as I can tell, she doesn't have any weird feats or abilities that would show up as anything other than human, so yeah, human. Now when it comes to Fern's class, I do kind of bend but not break one of the rules, and I do that because Fern fights in a very different way from Frieren. Quite a few different characters have commented on how she casts her spells incredibly quickly, overwhelming them with a barrage of attacks, and she's just as quick with her defense, blocking multiple attacks from different angles. And to replicate this, I wanted to give Fern the Twin Spell and Quicken Spell metamagic options, but Fern doesn't have magic in her blood. I am fairly certain outside of demons that isn't really a thing in the Frieren world. Mages are taught magic, clerics get it through their gods, and demons get it through their blood. So while I could give her metamagic adept for a few sorcery points, I want her to be able to do this more than once. So regardless of Fern's muggle blood, I'm going to make her a sorcerer, but only for 3 levels. Mostly because the sorcerer subclasses don't really fit all that well, and I was just here for the metamagic and extra sorcery points, so go with like lunar sorcery or something, since it's not really going to be a big deal here. As for the rest of Fern's levels, they are going to go into wizard, just like her master Frieren. And since Frieren is the one who taught Fern most of everything she knows, she is going to be the same school of magic, that being war magic. It just fits really well with how Fern and Frieren fight. Arcane Deflection ups their AC and helps them with saving throws. Power Surge boosts Fern's very basic attacking spells even more, and if she happens to be concentrating on a spell like, I don't know, Fly, she gets another +2 to her AC, so she can actually have her armor be pretty high with Mage Armor, a little Dex, and the Shield spell. Now the fun thing with Fern is her spells, since she really only uses 2 in combat. An unnamed offensive spell, which is just lasers, and an unnamed defensive spell, which is very much just the Shield spell. But I think it's also important to note that these come in different levels, a small blast, a spread, or just a massive laser beam. The same goes for her barriers, with small shields to block certain areas, a wall of shields for a wall, or a big sphere for herself and others that can block magic and physical attacks. Now this isn't to say Fern doesn't have other spells, she actually has a lot of other spells. But she only ever uses the basic offensive and defensive spells in combat, since according to Frieren, that's all she needs to deal with mages in the current era. All of Fern's other spells are utility. She can make a small, almost holographic map, lift things with telekinesis, and obviously she can fly. And I'll put her other spells here on the screen as well. Since I want to focus on her combat spells, which again come in 2 forms, big lasers and shields. Now, while looking through Friren's various fights, I wanted to find the biggest display of magic she had. And I think that's this fight here during the first class mage exam, where after overwhelming this girl with a just Gatling gun of lasers, she leaves this massive carved out area with one big laser. And if that isn't the disintegration spell, I don't know what is. And yes, I know disintegration is a single target spell and wouldn't technically carve out a giant beam like this, but moving on. Like I said before, all of Friren's spells are effectively the same spell, just cast at different levels. And that's because they're all derived from the same spell, Zoltrak, originally a spell made by a demon to kill people. But after 80-ish to 100 years, it just kind of got absorbed into the human magic system and became basic, unnamed offensive magic. Something that every apprentice mage should know. And there are quite a few spells that fit in this kind of mold. Disintegrate is just the highest level one of them. Another slight rule break here, Frieren and by extension Frieren get Eldritch Blast as their most basic attacking magic. Yes, I know it is a warlock only cantrip, but rules are made to be broken. And if you want to say she grabbed it with like Magic Initiate, that is fine. But moving past the cantrip level, things get a little bit more interesting, since I kind of took these lasers as dealing force damage. There's clearly no elemental stuff happening here, so yeah. And that only leaves us with a few spells for her to fight with, like the first level spell Magic Missile, and yes, even the joke version Jim's Magic Missile, since it does work differently. Unlike the auto-hit version of the regular Magic Missile, Jim's Magic Missile still needs to have an attack roll, but it deals more damage, and deals even more damage when it crits. I actually really like Jim's Magic Missile. Those two work really well for a barrage of lasers, since upcasting gives you extra missiles for each one. This means Frieren could upcast Jim's Magic Missile to 5th level, giving her 7 2d4 missiles, and then as an action, fire 3 1d10 Eldritch Blasts, forcing whatever poor mage she's firing them at to make 10 different concentration checks assuming they all hit, which would also deal around 60 damage with average rolls, and for a wizard that is a lot of damage to take. The other side is also really easy, with the first level defensive spells being Mage Armor and Shield, which incidentally enough makes you immune to Magic Missile, because in Frieren, that same spell was made specifically to counter Zoltrak and the spells derived from it. But in this case, it just gives you a +5 to your AC and immunity to Magic Missile. Another option for a more spread out and closer ranged blast for Frieren is Pulse Wave, a 30-foot cone of force damage. But this also feels a lot more situational, since typically Frieren just bombards people with small lasers instead of doing one big blast. She also gets some less direct defensive spells with Counterspell and Dispel Magic. Not only does she need these for her war magic stuff, but they can also be easily reflavored as blocking magic, especially with Counterspell. And with her war magic, Frieren is actually going to be pretty hard to hit outside of AoEs, which are still kind of an issue if she's only using Shield. But Frieren does have an answer for that. Like I showed before, she's able to make a sphere of barriers to cover every angle at once. And there are 2 spells that work for this. Resilient Sphere, which is really more useful around somebody else, and the Druid-only Anti-Life Shell. Yes, Druid-only, do I care? Not really. It blocks melee attacks, but ranged stuff can still go through it, unfortunately. You could kind of argue for like Platinum Shield, but that's more like a buff and not a barrier. If you want to take it, that's fine. I'm not going to add it to a list though. Now, only doing force damage does kind of limit Frieren in combat, but not really. There are very few things that are immune or even resistant to force damage. But just in case, I did want to give her one spell that still mostly fit the theme, but dealt a different type of damage. And that is Sunbeam, which does 8d6 radiant damage each time you use it after you cast it as an action. Meaning Frieren could quicken spell Disintegrate or just a really high level Magic Missile, and then as an action use the pre-cast Sunbeam for even more damage. And again, Frieren does have plenty of other spells, they're just mostly utility spells that she uses outside of combat. And yeah, that's Frieren.
I'm sorry, I was thirsty!
Now I know this series is fairly young, but if you've watched the previous videos, you know I don't usually go to level 20, I've only done it one time. But Frieren is, yeah, she's gonna be one of those exceptions. She is honestly well beyond level 20. Almost 100 years before the current story, so she's had 100 years to work on since this feat, she had the imprisonment spell and used it on this big demon guy. Elves also just work differently in Frieren, living well past 1,000 years with seemingly no upper limit to how old they can get, and they sleep. Frieren especially sleeps a lot. She can never seem to get enough sleep. So yeah, Frieren is an elf, and she's built in much the same way as Fern is, because, you know, she taught Fern how to be a mage. At first I did try to have them with different schools of magic, but war magic just works too well with how Frieren fights and does stuff. But she is a much higher level, and that means she gets the final feature for war magic, letting her reflect damage whenever she uses arcane deflection. And of course she has some stronger spells than Fern does. She also just has a bunch more spells than Fern, but that's because Frieren has a strange hobby of going and collecting folk magic, which is really just like cantrips and first level spells that have very niche uses. Like cleaning specifically bronze statues, turning grapes sour, creating flowers, and just a bunch of other weird things. So you can kind of assume that if there is a utility spell, Frieren has it. Oddly enough though, Frieren doesn't actually have a cleaning spell. Like again, she has a spell to specifically clean bronze statues or remove rust from pots, but she can't clean a stone statue or her clothing. Now something kind of funny about Frieren is despite how she taught Fern, in the past she used to go firing off flashy spells all the time, like Fireball, Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, and Firestorm. And in her fight with Aura, this powerful demon lady with the scales, she dispelled powerful magic controlling several corpses at once. But nowadays she mostly uses one spell, her own version of Zultrak that she modified to be perfect for killing demons. This is also the same spell that she taught Fern, so all the spells we covered for her in terms of combat magic also apply to Frieren. Eldritch Blast, both magic missiles, Pulse Wave, and Disintegrate. She also has some smaller spells like Misty Step for short-range teleportation, Locate Object for finding lost objects, and Arcane Lock, although we don't technically see Frieren use Arcane Lock. Now I'm sure there is a treasure trove of more powerful spells that Frieren has at her disposal, but I'm only going off of the anime, which means there's only a few more things to cover. One of those is this, when a clone of Frieren summoned a black hole, which from what I was told after the original version of this video is anime only, but hey, I'm going off the anime. Now when it comes to doing anything that's like a black hole, there's only really two spells that fit the bill, and that is the 8th level spell Darkstar or the 9th level spell Ravenous Void. Both are very black hole themed, and since Frieren is going to be well beyond level 20, she can take both. Outside of that though, Frieren takes a few feats like Magic Initiate 1 to 2 times for various spells. One of these is for Eldritch Blast, and the other, funnily enough, is to jump over to the Cleric list so Frieren can grab like Cure Wounds or something, since in this world human and elven magic isn't able to heal, so Frieren carries around a holy text just in case. She's also kind of immune or just has a super high resistance to charms and mind control. And in D&D, elves are resistant to charms and stuff like that, so that fits, but for Frieren they just kind of like never work on her. There are plenty of ways you could rationalize this with just like a super high wisdom score on top of having advantage, but I also like the idea that she has special spells set up for it, like having the contingency spell cast Dispel Magic on her if she's ever charmed. Now given how old and strong Frieren is, I keep saying she's beyond level 20, but realistically I'm only going to level 20 here. If you wanted to do like Gestalt or something where you take multiple levels in different classes at the same time, then you could do that, but that's all up to you. Oh, do give her the Warcaster feat though. Concentration is very important, and Frieren managed to analyze and then dispel a giant barrier in the middle of a fight with another very powerful wizard. Now there is one more thing that I really need to cover since it's kind of a big part of Frieren, her mana suppression. And as far as I can tell, there's only one real way to do this, if you bend the rules a little bit. There's a spell called Nishtul's Magic Aura, letting you make magical things appear non-magical and magical things appear non-magical. So it's reasonable to assume that you could technically cast this on yourself to make you appear like a less powerful caster. Like I said, that's kind of stretching the rules and would really be up to your DM if they would allow this. Oh, and one last spell to grab for Frieren. Locate Creature. She's probably going to ignore the results anyway, but it will at least let her know if there's a mimic nearby.
Get me out! It's wet and terrifying in here!
And that about does it. I know this video is technically a repost, but I wanted to put it here just because this is where these kind of videos are going to go from now on. So yeah. And I do apologize that this isn't Soul Eater, I know that one won, but don't worry, those characters are already done. I'm just giving myself some more time to work on it and work on Extra Life stuff. Because we are putting a ton more work into Extra Life this year. Again, we have a bunch of guests, we're going to have a schedule set up so we're not just like, let's play this now or this now. So yeah, a lot more work, we're just setting stuff up. And if you want to support me and the channel, you can do so on Patreon. You can get these character files for $1, vote on the polls at $5, and if you really want to support me, there is a $10 tier, but you don't gotta do that one. That's just there for if you really want to throw money at me. I'm probably also going to have like a suggestion thing on Patreon, so if you guys want to post your suggestions for future team builds there and not have them drowned out by the YouTube comments here, you can do that over on Patreon. But yeah, that's going to do it. I will see you all next week. Actually, I hope I'll see you on the stream on Saturday. And as always, have a wonderful day.